Sometimes the most successful people forget where they came from. Sometimes it takes a child to remind them who they used to be. Dorian Langston built a luxury piano empire from nothing, but success hardened his heart against anyone who looked like his former self. At his company's gala, when a homeless girl slipped past security and asked, "Can I play for food?" he joined the crowd's laughter. But when she sat at his grand piano and began playing, something extraordinary happened. The melody was the exact piece his late mother once played during nights of poverty, a song he'd forgotten. His laughter died, armor cracked, and tears he hadn't shed in decades began falling. What happened next would change both lives forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the 42nd floor of the Langston Tower, illuminating dust motes that danced like memories in the golden light. Dorian Langston stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office, watching the city wake beneath him. At 55, he had everything a man could want: wealth that exceeded most small nations' budgets, a penthouse that graced architectural magazines, and a business empire built on the world's finest pianos. Yet as he stood there in his perfectly tailored Italian suit, adjusting the platinum cufflinks that had cost more than most people's cars, something felt hollow. His reflection stared back from the glass, silver threading through his close-cropped black hair, lines around dark eyes that had seen too much, accomplished too much, lost too much along the way. The face looking back was that of a stranger, someone who bore little resemblance to the scared 8-year-old boy who once slept on church pews and counted pennies for day-old bread. "Mr. Langston?" Marcus Chen's voice interrupted his thoughts. His assistant stepped into the office, carrying a steaming cup of Ethiopian coffee, Dorian's morning ritual, sourced from beans that cost $200 a pound. Marcus had worked for him for 7 years, efficient and unobtrusive, the way Dorian preferred all his relationships these days. "The board meeting agenda for this afternoon," Marcus said, placing a leather portfolio on the mahogany desk that dominated the room. "Mrs. Morrison wants to discuss the European expansion, and the quarterly reports look exceptional. Piano sales are up 18%, particularly the Virtuoso line." Dorian nodded without turning from the window. The Virtuoso line, handcrafted instruments that started at $60,000 and climbed towards 6 figures for the custom models. Each piano was a work of art, but they were art for the wealthy, music for the privileged few who could afford such luxury. Sometimes he wondered what his mother would think of what her son had built. Sarah Langston had played on an old upright piano with 3 broken keys and a pedal that stuck. She'd found it in the alley behind their tenement building, abandoned and weathered, but she'd seen music in it anyway. On nights when they had no heat and she could barely afford to keep the lights on, she would play soft melodies that transformed their cramped apartment into something magical. Her fingers would dance across the yellowed keys, and for those precious moments, they weren't poor. They weren't struggling. They were just a mother and son sharing something beautiful. "Sir?" Marcus cleared his throat gently. "There's also the matter of tonight's gala. The new concert grand will be unveiled, the limited edition piece. The mayor will be there, several city council members, and most of our major investors. The guest list is quite impressive. The gala." Dorian turned from the window and moved to his desk, where a small jewelry box sat half-hidden behind a stack of reports. Inside was his mother's locket, the only thing he'd kept from their old life. It was tarnished silver, nothing fancy, containing a faded photograph of the two of them taken at a church picnic when he was 9. His mother wore a yellow dress she'd sewn herself, and he stood beside her in his only good shirt. Both of them smiling despite having just $53 to their names. He touched the locket without opening it. He hadn't looked at the photograph in months, maybe years. Looking meant remembering, and remembering meant feeling, and feeling was a luxury he'd learned to abandon long ago. The success hadn't come easily. After his mother's death, when he was 17, cancer she couldn't afford to treat properly, Dorian had fought his way through every obstacle. Scholarships to business school, brutal entry-level jobs where he worked 100-hour weeks, climbing over anyone who stood between him and his goals. He'd learned that sentiment was weakness, that caring too much made you vulnerable, that the only reliable thing in life was money in the bank and power in your hands. His first piano company had been different, smaller, focused on making quality instruments accessible to music students and working musicians. But accessible meant smaller margins, and smaller margins meant constant struggle. So he'd pivoted, repositioned, transformed Langston pianos into Langston luxury, instruments that were as much status symbols as musical tools. The business had exploded, and with it his fortune. The presentation tonight will showcase our new model, Marcus continued, pulling out photographs from the portfolio. The Aurora Grand, handcrafted with rare Carpathian spruce, gold-plated hardware, mother-of-pearl inlays. It's already pre-sold to 3 collectors, and we haven't even unveiled it yet. Dorian studied the photographs. The Aurora Grand was undeniably beautiful, a work of art that would produce sublime music in the hands of a skilled pianist. It was also priced at $180,000, making it accessible to perhaps a few hundred people worldwide. Beautiful work, he said, and meant it. His craftsmen were artists, and their creations were genuine masterpieces. But as he looked at the gleaming instrument, he found himself thinking about that old, upright piano in the alley, the one his mother had rescued and loved despite its flaws. The intercom buzzed. "Mr. Langston," came his secretary's voice, "Mrs. Victoria Morrison is here for your 10 o'clock. Victoria Morrison swept into the office moments later, all sharp angles and sharper ambition. As the company's head of marketing and the only board member who dared challenge him directly, she commanded respect through sheer force of will. Her silver hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her grey suit conveyed power without ostentation. Dorian. She settled into the chair across from his desk without waiting for an invitation. "I've been reviewing the numbers for tonight's gala. We're expecting over 200 guests. Media coverage from 3 major outlets and several potential acquisitions opportunities. This could be our biggest quarter yet." She pulled out her tablet, swiping through projections and market analyses with practiced efficiency. "The European expansion is moving faster than anticipated. We have confirmed orders from galleries in London, Paris, and Vienna. The wealthy are always looking for the next exclusive item, and our pianos have become the ultimate luxury statement." Dorian listened, nodding at appropriate intervals, but his mind kept drifting to the locket on his desk. Victoria was brilliant. He'd recruited her from a top marketing firm 5 years ago, and she'd helped transform Langston Luxury into a global brand. But their conversations always felt like boardroom presentations, even when they were alone. "The demographics are particularly encouraging," Victoria continued. "Our average customer age is 53. Household income above 500,000 annually. These are people who value exclusivity, who want instruments that reflect their status as much as their musical taste. Status. The word sat strangely in his mind. His mother had never cared about status. She'd cared about music, the way a melody could transform an ordinary evening into something transcendent, the way a simple song could carry more meaning than 1,000 words. "There's one concern," Victoria's voice sharpened slightly. "Security for tonight's event. We've had reports of increased homeless activity in the area around the hotel. Nothing threatening, but it might affect the ambiance for our guests. I've arranged for additional private security to ensure the perimeter is clear." Dorian frowned. "Homeless activity? Just the usual, people looking for handouts from well-dressed guests. You know how it is at these events. Our clientele doesn't like to be reminded of society's problems when they're spending significant money. I've made sure they'll be moved along before guests arrive." Something uncomfortable twisted in Dorian's stomach. Once he would have been one of those people Victoria wanted moved along. Once he and his mother had stood outside fancy restaurants, not looking for handouts, but simply trying to stay warm on winter nights. "Perhaps that's not necessary," he said carefully. Victoria raised an eyebrow. "Dorian, these people are spending more on a single piano than most families earn in several years. The last thing we want is to make them uncomfortable about their wealth. Brand image is everything in luxury markets." Before he could respond, Marcus returned with another stack of papers. "The final guest list for tonight, sir. And Mrs. Morrison, the venue coordinator, called. They've confirmed the staging for the Aurora Grand. It will be the centerpiece of the showroom, positioned for optimal viewing during your presentation." Victoria smiled, the sharp expression she wore when everything was proceeding according to plan. "Perfect. Dorian, your speech is scheduled for 8:30 immediately after dinner. Keep it elegant, aspirational. Remind them that owning a Langston piano isn't just about music. It's about joining an exclusive community of discerning individuals. An exclusive community." The phrase echoed in his mind as Victoria gathered her materials and left for another meeting. Once upon a time, his mother had believed that music belonged to everyone, that beauty wasn't something you purchased, but something you created, discovered, shared. She'd taught him that a song played with love on a broken piano was worth more than perfection played without passion. He picked up the locket again, feeling its weight in his palm. Sarah Langston had died believing her son would use his gifts to bring music to people who needed it, not just to those who could afford it. She'd made him promise during those final difficult weeks that he would never forget where he came from or the people still struggling in places. Like their old neighborhood, it was a promise he'd broken so completely he'd almost forgotten making it. The afternoon passed in meetings and phone calls, the machinery of business grinding forward with its usual relentless efficiency. Sales projections, marketing strategies, production schedules, the elegant dance of commerce that had made him wealthy beyond measure. But as evening approached, and it came time to prepare for the gala, Dorian found himself standing again at his office window, looking down at the streets below. Somewhere down there were people like he used to be, people who loved music but could never afford instruments like the ones his company created. Children who might have his mother's gift for melody but would never get the chance to develop it on a quality piano. Families struggling to pay rent who still found joy in music, still gathered around old instruments to share songs and dreams. He'd built walls between himself and that world. Walls of money and success and carefully cultivated indifference. Tonight, surrounded by wealthy guests admiring expensive pianos, those walls would stand as tall as ever. As Marcus helped him into his tuxedo jacket and adjusted his bow tie, Dorian caught sight of his reflection in the office's mirror. The man staring back looked successful, confident, untouchable. It was the perfect image for tonight's event. The CEO who had conquered the luxury market, who commanded respect and admiration from peers and competitors alike. But behind his eyes, almost hidden beneath years of practiced composure, something flickered. A memory of a young boy who once sat beside his mother at an old piano, learning that music wasn't about perfection or expense, it was about heart. Tonight would be another triumph for Langston luxury, another step in building his empire of beautiful exclusive instruments. The Aurora Grand would dazzle his guests. Orders would be placed, champagne would flow, and his reputation would grow ever more golden. He had no way of knowing that in just a few hours, a small girl with dirty clothes and remarkable talent would slip past his security and ask a simple question that would shatter every wall he'd built. He had no way of knowing that his mother's favorite lullaby, a melody he'd buried beneath decades of ambition, was about to rise from the past and change everything. For now, he was simply Dorian Langston, CEO, preparing for another successful evening in his carefully constructed world. The ballroom of the Grand Metropolitan Hotel buzzed with nervous energy in the aftermath of the girl's performance. Conversations resumed in hushed tones, glasses clinked with less enthusiasm than before, and several guests cast uncertain glances toward the Aurora Grand where the child had sat just moments earlier. The security team had efficiently escorted her out through a side entrance, but her melody seemed to linger in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. Dorian stood frozen near the stage, his champagne glass forgotten in his hand. The familiar weight of his mother's locket pressed against his chest through his tuxedo shirt, and for the first time in years, it felt like it was burning. The melody the girl had played, every note, every pause, every subtle variation, matched perfectly the lullaby his mother used to sing on their darkest nights. Remarkable little display. Victoria appeared at his elbow, her voice carefully modulated to suggest controlled annoyance rather than genuine concern. "I've spoken with security about how she managed to get past 3 checkpoints. Heads will roll, I assure you." "The song," Dorian said quietly, still staring at the piano. "Did you recognize it?" Victoria frowned. "Some classical piece, I assume. Does it matter? The important thing is damage control. I've already had our photographer delete any images of the incident, and I'm confident we can keep it out of tomorrow's society pages." Mayor Reynolds approached with his wife, both wearing expressions of bemused concern. "Dorian, what an unexpected evening. That child, where on earth did she learn to play like that? Remarkable talent, really, despite the circumstances." "Indeed," Mrs. Reynolds added, adjusting her diamond necklace. "Though one does worry about security these days. I certainly hope measures will be taken to prevent such disruptions in the future." Dorian nodded automatically, making appropriate responses while his mind churned. The girl couldn't have been more than 8 years old, with tangled brown hair and clothes that had seen too many nights on the street. But her hands on the piano keys had moved with a confidence that spoke of real training, real understanding of the music. And that particular piece, it wasn't something a child would stumble upon by accident. "Ladies and gentlemen," Victoria announced, tapping her champagne flute with a small silver spoon. "If I could have your attention, please. Despite tonight's unexpected interlude, we're delighted to continue with our presentation of the Aurora Grand. Mr. Langston will now share the inspiration behind this extraordinary instrument." The crowd turned expectantly toward Dorian, but the words he'd rehearsed, polished phrases about craftsmanship, exclusivity and investment value, suddenly felt foreign on his tongue. Instead, he found himself thinking about his mother's hands on the keys of their old upright piano, about the way she'd close her eyes when she played, transported to somewhere beyond their small apartment and its constant worries. "The Aurora Grand," he began, his voice sounding distant to his own ears, "represents the pinnacle of musical craftsmanship. Each component has been selected for its ability to produce not just sound, but emotion. Music, after all, is about more than technical perfection. It's about the human connection. The stories we tell through melody, the words came automatically. But behind them, his thoughts were elsewhere. Where had the girl gone? Who was taking care of her? How had someone so young learned to play with such haunting beauty? The presentation continued for another hour. Guests examined the Aurora Grand, admired its gold-plated hardware and mother-of-pearl inlays, discussed delivery timelines and payment schedules. 3 orders were placed before the evening ended, nearly $500,000 in sales. By any measure, it was a successful event. But as the last guests departed and the hotel staff began clearing champagne glasses and removing flower arrangements, Dorian remained in the ballroom, standing beside the piano where the girl had sat. He pressed a single key, middle C, and listened to the pure tone fade into silence. "Sir?" Marcus approached cautiously. "The car is waiting whenever you're ready to leave." "The girl," Dorian said without looking up. "What happened to her after security removed her?" Marcus consulted his phone. "I can check with the head of security if you'd like. Though I imagine she was simply directed to leave the premises." "Check." 20 minutes later, Marcus returned with information that sat like lead in Dorian's stomach. The girl had been escorted to the street and told not to return. No further questions had been asked, no arrangements made for her welfare. She'd simply been removed from their exclusive world and released back into whatever circumstances had brought her there in the first place. The drive to his penthouse passed in silence. Dorian's driver navigated the late-night streets while classical music played softly through the car's premium sound system. Ironically, a piece by Chopin that his mother had loved. The city looked different somehow, as if the evening's events had shifted his perspective just enough to notice details he'd trained himself to ignore. They passed a homeless encampment under an overpass. Cardboard shelters arranged in neat rows like a makeshift neighborhood. A few blocks later, he spotted an elderly man sleeping in a doorway, his possessions arranged carefully beside him in plastic bags. These were people who existed in the spaces between Dorian's world and the comfort of home, invisible to those who could afford not to see them. His penthouse occupied the top 2 floors of an exclusive building overlooking Central Park, floor to ceiling. Windows provided panoramic views of the city, and the interior design reflected the same commitment to luxury that defined his business. Italian marble, handcrafted furniture, original artwork, everything carefully selected to project success and refinement. But tonight, the elegant space felt hollow. Dorian poured himself 2 fingers of 30-year-old scotch and stood at the windows, looking down at the streetlights that stretched to the horizon. Somewhere in that sprawling cityscape was a little girl with extraordinary musical talent and nowhere safe to sleep. He moved to his study, a room lined with mahogany bookshelves and dominated by a concert grand piano, not one of his company's instruments, but the restored upright that had belonged to his mother. He'd had it professionally refurbished years ago, replacing the broken keys and fixing the sticky pedal, but he rarely played it anymore. It felt too much like looking backward. Tonight, however, he sat on the familiar bench and placed his fingers on the keys. The melody came back to him slowly, hesitantly, his mother's lullaby, the one the girl had played with such heartbreaking beauty. Note by note, the song emerged from decades of buried memory, carrying with it the scent of his mother's perfume and the sound of her voice humming along. The phone rang just after midnight, interrupting his playing. Marcus's voice was apologetic but urgent. "Mr. Langston, I'm sorry to call so late, but I thought you'd want to know. I contacted our security firm about the girl from tonight. They made some inquiries. And? Her name is Emma Richardson. 8 years old, been living on the streets for about 6 months. Before that, she was in foster care but aged out of the system early due to overcrowding. Sir, she's been spotted near the hotel before, apparently drawn by the music from events like ours." Dorian set down his scotch, his hand trembling slightly. 6 months on the streets? She's 8 years old. There's more, sir. I had one of our contacts at the newspaper pull some background. There's a photo from last week, a story about the city's growing homeless population. Emma's in it. The next morning, Dorian found himself staring at a newspaper photograph that made his chest tight. It showed a street corner downtown, where several homeless individuals had gathered near a church soup kitchen. And there, sitting on a concrete step with her arms wrapped around her knees, was the girl from the gala, Emma, even in the grainy newsprint. Her eyes held the same haunting quality that had captured the ballroom's attention. The caption read, "Among the city's growing homeless population are increasing numbers of children, like 8-year-old Emma Richardson, who lost her foster placement and now lives on the streets." He studied the photograph for a long time, noting details the security cameras at the gala had missed. The careful way Emma had arranged her few possessions beside her, a small backpack, a jacket that was too large, and what appeared to be a piece of cardboard with something drawn on it. Her posture suggested wariness but not defeat, as if she was simply waiting for something to change. The article went on to discuss municipal policies and budget constraints, statistics about homelessness and the challenges facing social services. But for Dorian, the words blurred together. All he could see was the small girl who had somehow learned his mother's lullaby and played it with such profound understanding that it had cracked open emotions he'd spent decades learning to suppress. That afternoon, he made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of attending his scheduled board meeting, Dorian drove downtown to the area where the photograph had been taken. He parked his luxury sedan 2 blocks away and walked, drawing curious glances from pedestrians who weren't accustomed to seeing men in $1,000 suits wandering through their neighborhood. The street corner from the newspaper photo was easy to find. The church soup kitchen operated out of a basement entrance, with a small sign promising hot meals and no questions asked. Several people sat on the steps or leaned against the building's brick facade, some talking quietly, others simply watching the world pass by. But Emma wasn't there. Dorian approached one of the volunteers, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and worn hands who was distributing sandwiches from a large cooler. "Excuse me," he said, feeling suddenly self-conscious about his expensive clothes and obvious wealth. "I'm looking for someone, a little girl named Emma, 8 years old, brown hair." The woman studied him with the careful assessment of someone who'd learned to be protective of vulnerable people. "You family?" "No, I'm—" Dorian paused, unsure how to explain. "I met her recently. I wanted to help. Help how?" The simple question made him realize he hadn't thought that far ahead. What kind of help could he offer? Money seemed inadequate, and his world of business solutions felt completely irrelevant to the complexities of homelessness and child welfare. "I don't know yet," he admitted. "But she's talented, musically talented. And she's just a child." The woman's expression softened slightly. "Emma comes by sometimes, but she's not here today. Girl's got pride, that one. Takes food when she needs it, but she's not looking for handouts. Always polite, always says thank you." She paused, considering. "Musical talent, you said?" "She played piano beautifully. I've never heard anything like it." "Huh." The woman nodded slowly. "That explains the cardboard keyboard she carries around. Thought it was just a child's game, but maybe there's more to it. A cardboard keyboard." The image formed in Dorian's mind. Emma practicing on drawn keys, keeping her musical skills alive without access to an actual instrument. The dedication implied by such determination made his throat tight. "If you see her," he said, pulling out a business card, "would you tell her that Dorian Langston would like to speak with her?" "About music." The woman took the card, reading it with raised eyebrows. "Langston luxury pianos. Fancy stuff." "Yes, but—" He stopped, realizing that his entire brand was built on exclusivity, on keeping music expensive and elite. "Just tell her I'd like to talk, please." Walking back to his car, Dorian felt as if he were emerging from a long sleep. The contrast between his morning board meeting, discussions of profit margins and market expansion, and this simple street corner where people struggled for basic survival, was jarring. He'd built his entire adult life around insulating himself from this kind of raw need, this reminder of how precarious existence could be. But Emma's melody had torn through those carefully constructed barriers like they were made of paper. And now, driving back toward his world of luxury and comfort, he found himself unable to stop thinking about a little girl with a cardboard piano somewhere in the city, practicing music on keys she'd drawn herself. The storage closet in Dorian's penthouse had remained untouched for nearly 15 years. Located behind his study, it held the remnants of his life before Langston luxury became his singular focus: college textbooks, old photographs, and 3 cardboard boxes that contained everything he'd kept from his childhood. As he knelt on the hardwood floor Sunday morning, wearing jeans and a sweater instead of his usual business attire, dust motes danced in the shaft of sunlight streaming through the nearby window. The first box contained school records and report cards, evidence of the studious boy he'd been, despite their difficult circumstances. The second held photograph albums, images of birthday parties at the church, Christmas mornings when his mother had somehow managed to find small gifts despite their empty bank account, ordinary moments that had seemed precious enough to preserve. But it was the third box that made his hands tremble as he lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in a faded blue scarf that still carried traces of his mother's perfume, was Sarah Langston's collection of handwritten sheet music. The pages were yellowed with age, covered in her careful handwriting, notes and measures transcribed in the precise script she'd learned during her brief stint at the community college before financial reality forced her to drop out. Most were folk songs and hymns, simple melodies that could be played on their old upright piano. But there, near the bottom of the stack, was the piece that had haunted him since the gala, Moonlight Dreams. That's what she'd titled it, writing the words in elegant cursive at the top of the page. Below the title, in smaller print, she'd added, "For Dorian, when the nights get too dark to see tomorrow." He sat back on his heels, studying the sheet music with a mixture of reverence and pain. This was his mother's original composition, written during one of their darkest periods when they'd been evicted from their apartment and spent 2 weeks sleeping in her car. She'd hummed the melody to him on those cold nights, her voice soft and steady, promising that morning would come and things would get better. The musical notation was simple but profound, with subtle variations that revealed her natural understanding of emotional expression. She'd never had formal training beyond a few childhood lessons, but her instinct for melody was remarkable. Looking at the notes now, Dorian could hear exactly how Emma had played it, with the same delicate phrasing, the same gentle emphasis on the minor key progression that gave the piece its haunting quality. But how could an 8-year-old homeless girl know this song? His mother had never published her compositions, never shared them beyond their small apartment. The melody had died with her, or so he'd believed. His phone buzzed with a text from Victoria. "Emergency board meeting scheduled for tomorrow, 9 a.m. Need to discuss the irregularities in your recent behavior and their potential impact on company image." Irregularities. The word stung because it suggested that caring about Emma, wanting to help a homeless child, was somehow inappropriate for a CEO. He set the phone aside and returned to the sheet music, tracing his finger along the melody line his mother had drawn with such careful attention to detail. Memory flooded back with surprising intensity. He was 9 years old again, sitting beside his mother on the bench of their battered upright piano. Her hands guided his small fingers across the keys as she taught him the piece note by note. "Music isn't about playing the right notes. Honey," she'd said, her voice patient despite their latest eviction notice sitting unopened on the kitchen table. "It's about finding the feeling inside the notes and sharing it with the world. This song, it's about hope when everything looks hopeless. Promise me you'll remember that," he had promised. And then he'd forgotten completely, burying the memory beneath decades of ambition and calculated success. The boy who'd played Moonlight Dreams with tears in his eyes had transformed into a man who measured music only in terms of profit margins and market positioning. The irony was bitter. He'd built an empire selling instruments to people who collected them like art pieces, while the music that had shaped his soul remained locked away in a storage closet. How many of his customers actually played the pianos they purchased? How many understood that music was meant to heal, to connect, to transform ordinary moments into something transcendent? Monday morning arrived with unusual weight. Dorian dressed carefully for the board meeting, choosing a navy suit that projected authority, while his mind churned with questions about Emma and the mysterious connection between her and his mother's composition. Marcus greeted him in the office with his usual efficiency, but there was concern in his assistant's eyes. The board members began arriving early, Marcus reported. "Mrs. Morrison seems particularly focused today. She's been on her phone with several major investors. The boardroom on the 38th floor commanded stunning views of the city, its polished tables surrounded by chairs that had hosted countless meetings about expansion, acquisitions, and profit optimization. Victoria sat at the head of the table opposite Dorian's usual position, flanked by the 5 other board members who governed Langston Luxury's strategic direction. "Thank you all for coming on short notice," Victoria began before Dorian had fully settled into his chair. I've called this meeting to address some concerns about recent developments that could affect our company's reputation and market position. Dorian raised an eyebrow. What developments? Your behavior at Friday's gala, for starters. Multiple guests have mentioned your distracted demeanor during the presentation, and there are questions about how security was compromised. But more troubling are reports that you've been seen in less desirable areas of the city, apparently searching for the homeless child who disrupted our event. The other board members shifted uncomfortably. Robert Chen, Marcus's uncle and the company's head of finance, cleared his throat. Dorian, we're concerned about the optics. Our brand is built on exclusivity and sophistication. Any association with, he paused delicately, social issues could dilute our market position. Social issues, Dorian repeated slowly. You mean helping a homeless child? That's not what we mean, Victoria said sharply. Of course, charitable work is admirable, but there are appropriate channels for such activities. Board-approved foundations, tax-deductible donations, structured philanthropic initiatives. What you're doing appears personal and uncontrolled, which raises questions about your judgment and priorities. Dr. Margaret Foster, the longest-serving board member and a renowned music professor, leaned forward. Dorian, we've all heard whispers about your recent distraction. Missed meetings, delayed decisions on the European expansion, failure to review the quarterly marketing strategy. Is everything all right? The question hung in the air, and Dorian realized he was at a crossroads. He could apologize, promise to refocus on business, and return to the comfortable distance he'd maintained from anything that threatened his carefully constructed world. Or he could tell them the truth, that a little girl's music had reminded him of promises he'd forgotten and values he'd abandoned. The child, he said carefully, has extraordinary musical talent. She played a piece that... He stopped, unsure how to explain without revealing too much about his personal history. Talent is irrelevant, Victoria interrupted. There are thousands of talented children in the world. We can't help them all, and we certainly can't compromise our business interests for random sentimental attachments. Random sentimental attachments. The phrase echoed in Dorian's mind as he looked around the table at faces that reflected his own transformation over the decades. Successful, focused, insulated from the messiness of genuine human need. These people had helped him build an empire, but they'd also helped him forget who he used to be. I understand your concerns, he said finally, but I think there might be ways to help this child that could actually benefit the company. Music education initiatives, perhaps. Scholarship programs. Robert shook his head. Dorian, our shareholders invest in luxury goods, not social programs. The moment we start diluting our brand with charity work, we lose the exclusivity that drives our premium pricing. The meeting continued for another hour, with Victoria presenting market research about brand positioning and competitive analysis of luxury piano manufacturers. Every chart and graph reinforced the same message. Langston Luxury succeeded because it remained above the concerns of ordinary people, because it offered entry into an exclusive world that most could never access. As the board members filed out, Victoria lingered behind. I need you to understand something, Dorian. 3 major investors have already called me with concerns about your recent behavior. If this continues, they'll start questioning your leadership. That could trigger a vote of no confidence, which none of us want. After she left, Dorian sat alone in the boardroom, staring out at the city spread below. From this height, the streets looked orderly and clean, the complexities of human struggle reduced to abstract patterns of traffic and architecture. But he knew that somewhere down there, Emma was carrying her cardboard keyboard, keeping her musical dreams alive despite having nowhere safe to sleep. That afternoon, he made another decision that would have surprised his board. Using a private investigator his company employed for background checks on high-level hires, he initiated a careful search for Emma Richardson, not to remove her from the streets that required expertise he didn't possess, but to understand how she'd learned his mother's song and what other mysteries connected their lives. The investigator, a former police detective named Sarah Winters, took the assignment with professional discretion. Within 2 days, she'd compiled a preliminary report that made Dorian's hands shake as he read it. Emma had been found abandoned as an infant, placed in foster care, with no information about her biological parents. Her foster families had noted her unusual affinity for music, and one had even arranged piano lessons until budget constraints forced them to stop. But it was the final detail that stopped Dorian's breath. Emma's first foster family had lived in the same neighborhood where he and his mother had spent his early childhood. The same apartment building, in fact, on different floors. It was possible, just possible, that a young Emma had heard his mother playing through the thin walls, had absorbed the melody that would later emerge at a luxury piano gala years later. The connection felt too significant to be coincidental, but too fragile to fully trust. As he sat in his office that evening, holding his mother's sheet music and reading about Emma's background, Dorian felt the walls he'd built around his heart beginning to crack in ways that both terrified and exhilarated him. Whatever was happening, whatever strange convergence had brought Emma and her music back into his life, he knew he couldn't ignore it. The board might see her as a threat to their business model, but she represented something far more important, a chance to honor promises he'd made to his mother, and perhaps to find his way back to the person he'd been before success had taught him to stop caring. The address Sarah Winters provided led Dorian to a part of the city he hadn't seen in decades. The underpass near Riverside Park had been transformed into an informal homeless camp, with cardboard shelters arranged in loose clusters that suggested both community and privacy. As he parked his sedan 2 blocks away and walked toward the encampment, Dorian felt like he was stepping back in time to the nights when he and his mother had sought shelter wherever they could find it. It was Wednesday afternoon, and the autumn air carried the sharp promise of winter. Most of the camp's residents were elsewhere, probably at day labor sites, social services offices, or simply wandering the city in search of food and temporary work. But as Dorian approached the cluster of makeshift homes, he heard something that made him stop. The soft sound of someone humming, following the melody. He found her. Emma sat cross-legged in front of a carefully constructed shelter made from large cardboard boxes reinforced with packing tape and plastic sheeting. The structure was surprisingly sophisticated for something built by an 8-year-old. Walls angled to shed rain, a flap door that could be secured from inside, even small windows covered with clear plastic. But what took Dorian's breath away was what she was doing. Spread on the ground in front of her was a large piece of cardboard, approximately 3 feet by 2 feet, on which someone had drawn piano keys with remarkable precision. The keys were outlined in black marker, with the sharps and flats carefully positioned, and Emma's small fingers moved across them with focused concentration as she hummed the melody from the gala. "Moonlight Dreams," she was playing, just as his mother had written it, complete with the subtle variations that made the piece so haunting. Her fingers pressed the drawn keys as if they were real, her posture and hand position showing formal training despite her current circumstances. Dorian stood motionless, watching this child practice music on a piano that existed only in marker lines and imagination. The dedication it represented, the determination to keep her musical skills alive despite having no access to an actual instrument, struck him with overwhelming force. "You play beautifully," he said softly. Emma's head snapped up, her body tensing with the reflexive wariness of someone who'd learned that strangers could represent either help or danger. She was smaller than she'd appeared at the gala, her brown hair tangled and her clothes showing the wear of extended outdoor living. But her eyes held the same intelligence and depth that had captivated the ballroom audience. "You're the man from the fancy party," she said. Not accusation, but simple recognition. The one who was crying. The directness of her observation caught him off guard. "Yes, my name is Dorian. Dorian Langston." She nodded gravely, as if filing the information away. "I'm Emma. I'm sorry I crashed your party. I heard the piano and I haven't been able to play a real one in so long." "How long?" She considered the question with the seriousness of someone much older. 8 months, maybe 9, since Mrs. Patterson had to give me back to the state. She couldn't afford to keep me anymore after her husband got sick. The casual way she mentioned being given back, like a returned library book, made Dorian's chest tight. "Where do you live now?" Emma gestured toward her cardboard shelter. "Here mostly. Sometimes the church lets us sleep inside when it's really cold, and there's a lady who runs a sandwich program who lets me help her sometimes. But mostly here. Us? Me and Mr. Wilson." She pointed toward another shelter about 20 feet away. "He used to be a music teacher before he got sick and couldn't work anymore. He's the one who taught me to read the notes on my practice piano." Dorian looked more carefully at the cardboard keyboard, noticing details he'd missed in his initial shock. The proportions were exact, the spacing between keys precisely measured. Someone with real musical knowledge had helped create this ingenious substitute. "Mr. Wilson taught you the song you played at the gala." Emma's expression grew thoughtful. "Not exactly. I mean, he helped me learn to read music better, and he showed me about hand position and fingering. But that song, I've known it forever. It used to help me sleep when I was little and scared." "Forever?" "Well, not really forever, but since I was very small. I lived in an apartment building where someone played piano at night sometimes. The music would come through the walls, and there was this one song that was so pretty and sad and hopeful all at the same time. I memorized it by listening." Dorian's heart hammered against his ribs. "Do you remember where this was?" "What building?" Emma scrunched her face in concentration. "It was called Riverside Apartments, I think. Really old building with green doors and stairs that creaked. I was in foster family number 2, the Garcias. They were nice, but they had too many kids already." She paused. "Why?" Before Dorian could answer, a voice called out from the neighboring shelter. "Emma, everything okay over there?" An elderly black man emerged from the cardboard structure, moving with the careful deliberation of someone whose body had endured more than its share of hardship. He was thin but dignified, wearing a worn suit jacket over jeans, and carrying himself with the bearing of someone who remembered better times. "Mr. Wilson," Emma said, relief evident in her voice. "This is Dorian. He's the man from the piano party I told you about." Mr. Wilson approached cautiously, his eyes taking in Dorian's expensive clothes and general aura of prosperity. "Charles Wilson," he said, extending a hand. "Emma mentioned your event. Said you had a beautiful piano." "She's extraordinarily talented," Dorian replied, shaking the older man's hand. "You've been teaching her?" Charles smiled with obvious pride. "Teaching her? No, sir. That child was born with more musical intuition than I developed in 30 years of classroom instruction. I've just been helping her maintain her skills with what we have available." He gestured toward the cardboard keyboard. "I drew that for her about a month ago. She was getting frustrated trying to practice on air, so I measured out proper key spacing and proportions. It's not ideal, but it allows her to keep her muscle memory active and work on fingering patterns. It's wonderful," Dorian said, and meant it. The makeshift instrument represented more dedication to music than most of his wealthy customers showed toward their expensive pianos. "Mr. Wilson used to teach at Jefferson Elementary," Emma added. "He knows everything about music. He's the one who taught me that the song I remembered was written in a minor key, and he helped me figure out all the harmonies." Charles laughed, but there was sadness in his eyes. "I taught 4th grade for 27 years before budget cuts eliminated arts programs and my position along with them. Couldn't find another teaching job at my age. Savings ran out during a medical emergency," and he shrugged philosophically. "Well, life has a way of humbling you when you least expect it." Dorian felt a familiar stab of recognition. He'd been one step away from Charles's fate many times during his youth, saved only by scholarships, luck, and his mother's unwavering determination to see him succeed. The difference between prosperity and homelessness was often much smaller than people wanted to believe. "The song Emma played," Dorian said carefully, "was written by my mother. It's called Moonlight Dreams." Both Emma and Charles stared at him in surprise. "Your mother was a composer?" Charles asked. "Not professionally. She wrote music for herself, for us. We lived in the Riverside apartments when I was a child. Emma, you would have heard my mother playing through the walls. Emma's eyes widened. That was your mother. She played the most beautiful music. Sometimes when I was scared or lonely, I would listen for her piano, and it always made me feel less alone. Her voice dropped to a whisper. Is she still there? Could I meet her? The innocent question hit Dorian like a physical blow. She died when I was 17, cancer. Oh. Emma's face crumpled with genuine sorrow. I'm sorry. She must have been a wonderful person to write such beautiful music. She was. Dorian's voice came out rougher than he intended. She would have liked you very much. She believed music belonged to everyone, not just people who could afford expensive instruments. The irony of his current business model hung in the air between them. Charles seemed to sense the subtext, studying Dorian with the perceptive eyes of someone who'd learned to read people's unspoken stories. Emma, Charles said gently, why don't you show Mr. Langston how you've been practicing scales on your keyboard? As Emma eagerly began demonstrating her practice routine, her fingers moving across the drawn keys with precision and enthusiasm, Dorian found himself fighting unexpected emotions. Here was a child who loved music with the same pure passion his mother had possessed, who practiced diligently despite having nothing but cardboard and imagination to work with. Watching her, he remembered his mother's words about music being a gift that should be shared, about talent being a responsibility as much as a blessing. Emma had been given extraordinary ability, but the world had given her no instrument to express it on, no support to develop it, no safety to ensure she'd survive long enough to share it. As the afternoon shadows grew longer and the camp began to stir with returning residents, Dorian realized he was facing the most important decision of his adult life. He could return to his penthouse, his board meetings, his profitable world of luxury instruments sold to wealthy collectors. Or he could find a way to honor his mother's memory and Emma's talent, even if it meant challenging everything he'd built his success upon. The choice should have been difficult. But sitting there beside a cardboard piano, listening to an 8-year-old girl practice scales with more dedication than most professional musicians, the answer felt surprisingly clear. Over the next 2 weeks, Dorian found himself living a double life that would have seemed impossible a month earlier. By day, he maintained his role as CEO of Langston Luxury, attending meetings about European expansion and reviewing production schedules for custom instruments that cost more than most people's annual salaries. By evening, he drove to the underpass near Riverside Park with bags of groceries, warm clothes, and supplies that Emma and Charles needed, but were too proud to ask for directly. The routine had started innocuously enough. The day after their first conversation, Dorian had returned with a sleeping bag, rated for cold weather, claiming he'd bought it for a camping trip that got cancelled. Emma had accepted it gratefully, and Charles had thanked him with the dignified appreciation of someone who understood both the value of help and the importance of maintaining self-respect. But as the days passed, Dorian's visits became more essential to his own well-being than to theirs. Watching Emma practice on her cardboard piano, listening to Charles share stories about his teaching career, experiencing their genuine care for each other despite their circumstances, these moments felt more real than anything in his corporate life. The contrast was becoming unbearable. During Thursday's executive meeting, while Victoria presented charts about market penetration in Asian luxury goods markets, Dorian found himself thinking about Emma's worn shoes and the way she shivered despite the warm clothes he'd brought her. When Robert Chen discussed profit margins on their latest limited edition series, Dorian remembered Charles mentioning that he rationed his diabetes medication because he couldn't afford regular doses. Dorian. Victoria's sharp voice cut through his distraction. The Asian distributors are waiting for your decision on the exclusivity terms. He refocused on the presentation, making appropriate responses, while a part of his mind calculated how much the profit from a single piano sale could do for Emma's situation. The numbers were staggering and sobering. One Aurora Grand could provide Emma with safe housing, proper nutrition and music lessons for an entire year. But that evening, as he watched Emma work through a complex piece by memory, her fingers dancing across cardboard keys with remarkable precision, he realized that money alone wouldn't solve the deeper issues at play. Emma needed more than charity. She needed a system that recognized her potential and provided pathways to develop it. That realization led him to make a decision that crossed several ethical lines. Using his company's connections with government agencies, Langston Luxury had security clearances for international sales that required background checks. He requested a comprehensive review of Emma's foster care history. The official justification involved a potential scholarship program his company was considering, which wasn't entirely a lie. The file arrived on Friday afternoon, delivered by Sarah Winters with the expression of professional concern. "This makes for difficult reading," she warned as she placed the thick folder on his desk. "The child's been through more than anyone should have to endure." Dorian waited until his office was empty before opening the folder. Inside were dozens of documents spanning Emma's 8 years, placement records, medical reports, psychological evaluations, and school assessments that painted a picture of a remarkable child failed by an overwhelmed system. The chronology was heartbreaking. Emma had been found as an infant in a hospital emergency room, abandoned with no identification except a note that read, "Please love her and help her find music." She'd been placed immediately into foster care, beginning a journey through 7 different homes over 8 years. The early reports were encouraging. Emma had been a quiet, observant child who adapted well to new situations and showed unusual responsiveness to music. Her first foster family, the Garcias, had noted in their monthly reports that Emma would become calm and focused whenever music played, and that she seemed to have an intuitive understanding of rhythm and melody. But the file also revealed the systemic problems that had shaped Emma's trajectory. Overcrowded foster homes, underfunded social services, caseworkers who changed so frequently that continuity of care was impossible. Emma had shown exceptional promise in school music programs, but those programs were often cut due to budget constraints. Foster families who wanted to nurture her talent couldn't afford private lessons, and those who could afford them weren't interested in making long-term investments in a child they viewed as temporary. One report, written by a music teacher at Emma's 3rd elementary school, made Dorian's hands shake as he read it. Emma Richardson demonstrates extraordinary musical aptitude that borders on genius level. Her perfect pitch, intuitive understanding of harmony, and emotional connection to musical expression are rare gifts that deserve professional development. However, without stable housing and consistent access to instruments, these talents are likely to remain undeveloped. This child could have a significant musical career with proper support. That assessment had been written 18 months ago. Since then, Emma had aged out of the child-focused programs and been placed in an emergency shelter system designed for short-term crisis intervention, not long-term development. Her file showed a heartbreaking pattern. Every time she began to flourish musically, circumstances would change. A foster placement would end, a program would lose funding, her family would move, and she'd have to start over. The most recent entry, dated just 3 months ago, was a brief note from a social worker. Placement at Harbour House ended due to facility closure. Subject is mature for her age and has requested independent living arrangement. Given current overcrowding in suitable foster homes, request has been approved, pending quarterly check-ins. Independent living arrangement. The bureaucratic language meant that an 8-year-old girl had been essentially emancipated because the system couldn't house her properly. The quarterly check-ins mentioned in the file had apparently never occurred. Emma had fallen through administrative cracks and been forgotten by the very agencies charged with her. Protection. Dorian closed the file and sat in the gathering darkness of his office, processing what he'd learned. Emma wasn't just homeless. She was systemically invisible, A child who'd been failed so completely by institutional care that she'd essentially been erased from official notice. Her extraordinary musical talent was being wasted not through malicious intent, but through the grinding inadequacy of underfunded social services. The injustice of it made him furious in ways he hadn't felt since his mother's death. Emma represented everything his mother had been. Someone with profound musical gifts who'd been denied opportunities because of circumstances beyond her control. The difference was that Emma was still a child, still developing, still capable of being helped if someone would take responsibility for her welfare, but helping her properly would require more than the secret grocery deliveries and warm clothes he'd been providing. It would require navigating legal systems, challenging bureaucratic inertia, and possibly exposing himself to scrutiny that could threaten his business reputation. His board would be apoplectic if they knew he was considering anything beyond arm's-length charitable donations. Saturday morning brought another crisis. When Dorian arrived at the underpass with his usual supplies, he found Emma sitting alone beside her shelter, tears streaming down her face. Charles was nowhere to be seen. "What's wrong?" Dorian asked, kneeling beside her. "Mr. Wilson got arrested," she said between sobs. "The police came yesterday and said he was trespassing, even though we've been here for months. They took him away, and I don't know where he is or when he's coming back." The news hit Dorian like a physical blow. Charles had become Emma's protector, teacher, and surrogate grandfather. Without him, she was completely alone, that were dangerous for an adult, let alone a child. "I don't know what to do," Emma continued. "Without Mr. Wilson, I don't have anyone to help me if something bad happens. And I can't practice my music the same way without him helping me with the hard parts, looking at this brave, talented child trying to hold herself together in an impossible situation." Dorian made a decision that would change both their lives. He couldn't navigate the foster care system quickly enough to help Emma through official channels. And he couldn't leave her alone on the streets while bureaucrats shuffled paperwork. "Emma," he said carefully, "how would you feel about staying somewhere safer while we figure out how to help Mr. Wilson and get you into a better situation?" She looked at him with the wariness of someone who'd learned that adult promises often led to disappointment. "Where?" "I have a guest room in my apartment. It's temporary, just until we can find you a proper placement that understands your musical talent." Emma was quiet for a long moment, considering. "Would I be able to practice piano?" "Real piano?" "Yes," Dorian said, thinking of his mother's restored upright piano. "You would definitely be able to practice piano." For the first time since he'd known her, Emma smiled, a genuine expression of hope that transformed her entire face. "Okay," she said simply. "I trust you." As they gathered her few possessions and prepared to leave the underpass, Dorian realized he was crossing a line from which there would be no return. Taking Emma home meant exposing his private life to scrutiny, challenging his carefully maintained separation between business and emotion, and potentially risking everything he'd built over decades of focused ambition. But watching Emma carefully fold her cardboard piano and place it in her backpack with the reverent care of someone handling a precious instrument, he knew he was making the only choice his mother would have respected. Some things were more important than protecting the walls he'd built around his heart. The first morning Emma woke up in Dorian's penthouse, she stood in the living room doorway for nearly 10 minutes, staring at his mother's restored upright piano with an expression of reverent wonder. Still wearing the clothes she'd slept in, a clean pajama set Dorian had hastily purchased the night before, she approached the instrument as if it might disappear if she moved too quickly. "May I?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dorian nodded, watching as she lifted the bench and sat with perfect posture, her small hands hovering over the keys. When she finally pressed middle C, the pure tone that filled the room seemed to transform the space completely. The luxury furnishings and designer artwork that had defined his home for years suddenly felt less important than this moment, a child reconnecting with her. Passion on an instrument that carried decades. of memory and meaning, Emma began playing Moonlight Dreams, and Dorian felt his mother's presence in the room so strongly it took his breath away. This was how the song was meant to be heard, played with love and understanding, filling a home with music that healed rather than impressed. As the melody faded, Emma turned to him with tears in her eyes. It sounds different on a real piano, better, like the music has room to breathe. The observation, so perceptive from someone so young, made Dorian realize how much he'd lost touch with the essential purpose of musical instruments. Somewhere in the drive to create increasingly expensive and exclusive pianos, he'd forgotten that they were meant to be vehicles for expression, not status symbols. That afternoon, while Emma napped, exhaustion finally catching up with her after weeks of sleeping in uncertain conditions, Dorian retreated to his study and opened a file cabinet he hadn't touched in years. Buried beneath marketing reports and financial projections was a folder labeled Company Foundation Documents. Inside was the original mission statement he'd written when starting Langston Pianos 15 years earlier. The document was yellowed with age, typewritten on letterhead that looked quaint compared to his current corporate branding. But reading it now, Dorian felt like he was encountering a stranger who happened to share his name. Langston Pianos exists to make high-quality musical instruments accessible to students, teachers and musicians who understand that music is not a luxury but a necessity of the human spirit. We believe that every person with musical passion deserves access to instruments that will help them grow, express themselves, and share their gifts with the world. Our success will be measured not by profit margins, but by the number of musicians we help discover and develop their talents. Below the mission statement, in his own handwriting, was a note he'd completely forgotten writing, in memory of Sarah Langston, who taught me that music belongs to everyone. The contrast between those idealistic words and his current business model was so stark it made him physically uncomfortable. When had he stopped caring about accessibility and started obsessing over exclusivity? When had he begun measuring success by how many people couldn't afford his instruments rather than how many could? The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It had been a gradual process of market pressures, board influence, and the seductive appeal of higher profit margins. Each decision had seemed logical in isolation, raising prices to improve quality, targeting wealthier customers to ensure sustainability, creating limited editions to enhance brand prestige. But collectively, those decisions had perverted his original vision into something his mother would have found unrecognizable. "What's that?" Emma's voice made him look up. She stood in the study doorway, looking refreshed from her nap, but curious about the papers scattered across his desk. "The original mission statement for my company," he said, not bothering to hide his discomfort. Emma approached and peered at the document with the intense focus she brought to everything related to music. "It says music belongs to everyone." "That's beautiful." She paused, considering. "Is that still what your company does?" The innocent question hit him like a physical blow. "Not exactly. Things changed over the years. Changed how?" Dorian struggled to find words that would explain his transformation without destroying Emma's faith in him. The business grew larger, and larger businesses have to think about different things. Making money, competing with other companies, keeping investors happy. Emma frowned. "But what about helping musicians?" "We still help musicians. We make very good pianos. How much do they cost?" The question he'd been dreading. "Our current instruments start around $60,000. Emma was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. "That's more money than most people have, isn't it?" "Yes. So most musicians can't afford your pianos." "That's right." She studied his face with the penetrating gaze of someone much older than 8. "That doesn't sound like music belonging to everyone." The simple truth, delivered without judgment or accusation, cut deeper than any board member's criticism ever had. Emma wasn't trying to make him feel guilty. She was simply pointing out the obvious contradiction between his stated values and his actual practices. "You're right," he said. "It doesn't." That evening, Emma asked if he would teach her proper piano technique. They spent 2 hours at his mother's upright, with Dorian showing her fingering patterns, posture adjustments, and breathing techniques he hadn't thought about in decades. Teaching her forced him to articulate concepts he'd internalized so completely, he'd forgotten he knew them. Music isn't just about playing the right notes, he found himself saying, echoing his mother's words from 30 years ago. It's about finding the emotion inside the melody and sharing it with anyone who's listening. Emma absorbed his instruction with remarkable quickness, her natural talent enhanced by proper guidance. But more surprisingly, teaching her rekindled something in Dorian that he'd thought was permanently buried, his own love for music as an art form rather than a business opportunity. After Emma went to bed, he remained at the piano, playing pieces he hadn't touched in years, Chopin nocturnes that had once moved him to tears, Bach inventions that challenged his technical skills, and eventually his mother's compositions. The music felt different than it had during his youth, richer, more nuanced, informed by decades of life experience, but also freed from the weight of survival that had shadowed his childhood playing. The next morning brought reality crashing back. Marcus called while Emma was still asleep, his voice tight with concern. "Mr. Langston, Mrs. Morrison has been trying to reach you since yesterday afternoon. There's an emergency board meeting scheduled for this morning, and she says it's imperative that you attend." The emergency meeting was a thinly veiled intervention. Victoria sat at the head of the conference table, flanked by 3 board members and a stack of documents that Dorian recognized as surveillance reports. His stomach dropped as he realized the extent to which his recent activities had been monitored and documented. "We need to discuss your increasingly erratic behavior," Victoria began without preamble. "Multiple witnesses have reported seeing you visiting homeless encampments, and now there are concerns about your personal living situation." Robert Chen slid a photograph across the table, a grainy image of Dorian helping Emma into his car outside the underpass. "The potential liability issues here are staggering. If this child has been staying in your home without proper legal guardianship arrangements, the company could face significant exposure." Dr. Foster leaned forward with genuine concern. "Dorian, we're worried about you. This obsession with helping one homeless child is affecting your judgment and potentially compromising everything you've built." "She's not just any homeless child," Dorian said, his voice calmer than he felt. "She's extraordinarily talented, and she's been failed by every system that should have protected her." "That's tragic," Victoria replied, "but it's not our responsibility. We're a luxury goods company, not a social services agency. Your personal charity work needs to remain separate from company operations." The meeting continued for an hour, with board members presenting evidence of his distraction, questioning his recent decisions, and strongly recommending that he end his involvement with Emma immediately. They offered alternative solutions, donating money to established charities, setting up a scholarship fund managed by professionals, anything that would maintain appropriate distance between his personal impulses and corporate responsibilities. As they spoke, Dorian found himself thinking about the mission statement hidden in his file cabinet, about the promises he'd made to his mother, and about Emma's simple observation that $60,000 pianos didn't make music accessible to everyone. The board members weren't wrong about the potential risks and complications of his current course, but they were measuring everything in terms of profit protection and liability management, never considering whether those were the right metrics for evaluating human worth. "I understand your concerns," he said finally, "but I'm not ending my relationship with Emma. If anything, I think we should be exploring ways to help more children like her." The silence that followed was profound and ominous. Victoria exchanged glances with the other board members before speaking in the tone of someone delivering an ultimatum. "Dorian, if you continue down this path, we'll have no choice but to question your fitness to lead this company. The shareholders and investors we represent have entrusted us with protecting their interests, and we can't allow personal sentiment to compromise those responsibilities. Walking back to his office after the meeting, Dorian realized he was approaching a point of no return. He could restore his focus to business operations, find Emma proper placement through official channels, and return to the comfortable distance he'd maintained from anything that threatened his carefully constructed world. Or he could honor the values his mother had instilled in him and find ways to make his company's resources serve something larger than shareholder profits. The choice should have been simple. But as he thought about Emma practicing on her cardboard piano, about Charles Wilson's dignified struggles, and about his mother's belief that music belonged to everyone, simple became the last thing it was. It was Emma's third morning in the penthouse when the conversation that would change everything began innocently enough. They were sharing breakfast, scrambled, eggs and toast that Emma had insisted on helping prepare when she mentioned something that made Dorian's coffee cup freeze halfway to his lips. "I've been thinking about the note," Emma said, methodically cutting her toast into small, precise squares. "The one that was with me when I was found at the hospital." Dorian had read about the note in her foster care file, but he'd never heard Emma discuss it directly. "What about it?" "It said, please love her and help her find music. Sometimes I wonder if my birth mother was a musician too. Maybe that's why I love it so much. Like it's in my blood or something." The file had mentioned that no information about Emma's biological parents had ever been discovered, despite investigation by social services. Her abandonment had been complete and anonymous, leaving no trail for anyone to follow. "Do you remember anything about her?" Dorian asked gently. Emma shook her head. "Not really. But sometimes I have these dreams, not clear pictures, just feelings. Like someone singing lullabies or the sound of piano music that felt safe." She paused, looking thoughtful. "There was one other thing in my file, though. A name." "What kind of name?" "The nurse who found me said there was a hospital bracelet on my wrist. Not an official one, but like a homemade identification band. It had Baby Richardson written on it in pen. The social worker thought Richardson might have been my mother's maiden name, since I didn't have a father's last name. Richardson." The name hit Dorian like an electric shock, though he couldn't immediately understand why. It felt familiar, significant, connected to something important he'd buried in memory. "Richardson," he repeated slowly. "Do you know that name?" Emma asked, noting his reaction. "I'm not sure. It sounds familiar, but I can't place it." He forced himself to smile reassuringly. Sometimes names just sound familiar, even when you don't really know them. But the conversation haunted him throughout the day. During a tedious meeting about supply chain logistics, his mind kept returning to the name Richardson and the nagging sense that it connected to something crucial in his past. It wasn't until that evening, while Emma practiced scales on his mother's piano, that the memory surfaced with devastating clarity. Richardson had been his father's second wife's maiden name. The realization hit him so hard he had to sit down. Marcus Langston had abandoned Dorian and his mother when Dorian was 12, disappearing one day with vague promises about finding better work in another city. They'd never heard from him again, despite his mother's efforts to track him down for child support. Dorian had spent years alternating between missing his father and hating him, eventually settling into a kind of numb acceptance that some people simply weren't capable of being reliable parents. But about 5 years after the abandonment, his mother had received a letter from a lawyer handling his father's affairs. Marcus Langston had died in a car accident, leaving behind debts and no assets. The letter had mentioned, almost in passing, that he'd been survived by a wife, his second wife, apparently named Jennifer Richardson Langston. Dorian had been 17 at the time, dealing with his mother's cancer diagnosis and working multiple jobs to pay for her treatment. The news about his father's death and secret second family had been just another blow in a series of devastating losses. He'd filed the information away and tried never to think about it again, but now, watching Emma play his mother's favorite song with tears running down his face, the mathematical possibilities were impossible to ignore. If his father had married Jennifer Richardson, and if Emma's biological mother had been named Richardson, and if Emma was approximately 8 years old, The timeline fit perfectly. Marcus Langston had died 8 years ago, right around the time Emma would have been born. If Jennifer Richardson had been pregnant when her husband died, if she'd been unable or unwilling to care for the baby alone, if she'd made the heartbreaking decision to surrender the child, Emma could be his half-sister. The thought was so staggering that Dorian spent the next 2 days in a state of carefully controlled anxiety, searching for ways to confirm or disprove his suspicions without alarming Emma. He couldn't simply ask her direct questions about her birth family without explaining why he wanted to know. And he wasn't ready to share his suspicions until he was certain. The solution came through Sarah Winters, the private investigator who'd helped him research Emma's background. When he called her with a delicate request for genetic testing, she was professional but concerned. DNA analysis isn't something you can do secretly. Mr. Langston, you'll need samples from both parties, and there are legal considerations about testing a minor without proper guardianship. What if I had theoretical samples? Dorian asked carefully. Hair follicles, for instance. There was a long pause. I would strongly advise against any testing that wasn't completely transparent and consensual. The legal ramifications could be severe, and the ethical issues are substantial. But hypothetically, another pause. Hypothetically, modern DNA testing can be performed on minimal samples and can provide definitive answers about familial relationships. But Mr. Langston, if you're considering what I think you're considering, you need to understand that genetic testing of this nature should be done through official channels with proper counseling and support systems in place. Despite Sarah's warnings, Dorian found himself collecting evidence with the methodical care of someone whose world might depend on the results. Emma's hairbrush yielded several samples with follicles attached, and his own genetic material was easy enough to obtain. The testing facility Sarah reluctantly recommended specialized in paternity and family relationship analysis, with results available within 72 hours. Those 3 days were the longest of Dorian's adult life. He continued his normal routines, teaching Emma piano, reviewing business reports, attending meetings, while internally preparing for news that would fundamentally alter his understanding of family, responsibility, and the strange coincidences that had brought them together. Emma seemed to sense his distraction without understanding its source. "Are you okay?" she asked one evening while they worked on a particularly challenging piece by Mozart. "You seem worried about something." "Just business concerns," he said, which was technically true. The potential revelation that Emma was his half-sister would certainly create business concerns, along with legal, emotional, and practical complications that made his current board trouble seem manageable by comparison. The results arrived on a Thursday afternoon, delivered in a plain envelope that Sarah handed him with obvious reluctance. "Whatever this says," she warned, "you need to handle it carefully. This child has been through enough trauma without adding family complications to her situation." Dorian waited until Emma was napping before opening the envelope in the privacy of his study. The report was clinical and definitive. DNA analysis indicates a 99.7% probability that the tested individuals share one biological parent. This level of probability confirms a half-sibling relationship. Emma was his sister, his father's child, abandoned as an infant when her mother couldn't cope with single parenthood. The little girl who'd been practicing music on cardboard keyboards and sleeping under bridges was his family, the only family he had left in the world. The revelation restructured every assumption he'd made about coincidence, destiny, and the forces that had brought them together. Emma hadn't learned his mother's song through random chance. She'd learned it because they'd lived in the same building as children, because their father had connected their lives in ways that transcended his abandonment and death. The melody that had triggered his emotional response at the gala was genuinely a family inheritance, passed from his mother to him and somehow absorbed by Emma during her earliest years. But with revelation came responsibility. Emma didn't know about their connection, didn't even know that her birth father had been married before or had another child. She'd constructed an identity around being alone in the world, and learning about their relationship would fundamentally change how she understood herself and her place in his life. More practically, if Emma was his half-sister, his decision to help her transcended charity and became family obligation. The board members who'd been questioning his judgment would find themselves dealing with someone protecting his only living relative, not indulging in random philanthropy. The legal complexities around her guardianship would change, as would the emotional stakes of every decision about her future. Sitting in his study with the DNA results in his hands, Dorian realized that his carefully constructed adult life, built on emotional distance, professional focus, and protective isolation, was completely obsolete. Emma wasn't a worthy cause he could support from arm's length. She was his sister, his responsibility, his family. Everything that happened to her now would happen to someone he was bound to by blood and shared history. The irony was profound. He'd spent decades convinced that his father's abandonment had taught him that family bonds were unreliable, that emotional attachments were weaknesses to be avoided. But Marcus Langston's failures had actually created a connection that transcended death. A second chance at family that came in the form of a homeless girl with extraordinary musical talent and unconscious knowledge of lullabies that had shaped both their childhoods. As Emma stirred from her nap and began practicing scales in the living room, Dorian faced the most important decision of his life. He could keep the genetic information to himself, continue helping Emma as a benevolent mentor, and maintain the emotional distance that had protected him for so long. Or he could tell her the truth and accept all the complications, responsibilities, and vulnerabilities that came with acknowledging family. The decision should have been difficult. But listening to his sister play their mother's piano, because that's what it was now, their mother's piano, the choice felt as inevitable as the melody she was creating. The Manhattan Conservatory of Music occupied a stately building on the Upper East Side, its limestone facade and wrought iron details reflecting the old-world elegance that attracted students from around the globe. As Dorian stood across the street from its main entrance, holding a rental agreement for the conservatory's smaller recital hall, he felt the weight of decisions that would determine not only Emma's future but their relationship as siblings. She didn't yet know she had. The audition arrangement had required 3 weeks of careful negotiation. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the conservatory's director of admissions, was initially skeptical about auditioning a child with no formal training records and an unconventional background. But when Dorian mentioned his company's previous donations to the school and offered to sponsor a full scholarship for the right candidate, doors had opened quickly. "The child you're recommending," Dr. Vasquez had said during their phone conversation, "must be truly exceptional for you to arrange such an elaborate audition process." "She is," Dorian had replied, and meant it with an intensity that surprised him. "She has the kind of natural talent that appears once in a generation." Now, reviewing the rental agreement that would give Emma access to the conservatory's Steinway concert grand for her audition, he felt the magnitude of what they were attempting. This wasn't just about getting Emma into a good music program. It was about proving that she belonged in the same elite circles that his business had always served, that her talent transcended the circumstances of her birth and upbringing. The past 3 weeks had been a whirlwind of intensive preparation. Emma had thrown herself into practice with the focused determination of someone who understood this might be her only chance. Every morning before school, he'd enrolled her in a private academy near his penthouse. She spent 2 hours working on technique. Every afternoon brought more practice, music theory lessons, and repertoire development. Dorian had hired Dr. James Morrison, a retired Juilliard professor, to help prepare Emma for the audition. The elderly musician had been skeptical when first asked to work with an 8-year-old street child. But Emma's first performance of Moonlight Dreams had silenced his doubts completely. "This child has perfect pitch," innate musical phrasing, and emotional depth that I rarely see in students twice her age, Dr. Morrison had told Dorian after their first lesson. With proper training, she could have a significant concert career, but she needs stability, consistent instruction, and access to quality instruments. Most importantly, she needs to know that someone believes in her potential unreservedly. That last observation had haunted Dorian as he wrestled with whether to tell Emma about their family connection. Believing in her potential unreservedly was easy. Her talent was undeniable. But did she need to know that his support came from blood obligation as well as genuine admiration for her abilities? The corporate pressure had intensified during Emma's preparation period. Victoria had called emergency board meetings twice, each time presenting evidence of Dorian's continued distraction and its impact on company operations. The European expansion had stalled while he focused on Emma's situation. Several major clients had complained about delayed responses to their inquiries. The company's stock price had begun fluctuating as investors questioned leadership stability. This obsession with one homeless child is destroying everything you've built, Victoria had said during their most recent confrontation. The board is losing confidence in your judgment, and frankly, so am I. If you don't end this immediately and refocus on business priorities, we'll have no choice but to call for a vote of no confidence. The threat wasn't empty. Victoria had the support of at least 3 board members, enough to challenge his leadership if she could convince one more to join her coalition. Robert Chen seemed increasingly sympathetic to her position. Worried about fiduciary responsibilities to shareholders, Dr. Foster remained supportive but concerned, urging Dorian to find more appropriate ways to help Emma that wouldn't compromise his professional standing. Adding to the pressure was unwanted media attention. A gossip columnist for the city's largest newspaper had somehow learned about Emma's presence in Dorian's life and was investigating what she called the mystery child living with the luxury piano mogul. Her initial inquiries had been polite but persistent, requesting interviews about his charitable activities and asking pointed questions about Emma's background and their relationship. Mr. Langston, the columnist, had said during a particularly uncomfortable phone call, "Sources suggest you've taken an unusual personal interest in a homeless child. Our readers would love to hear about this heartwarming story of corporate social responsibility." The implication was clear. Cooperate with the story or face potentially damaging speculation about his motives. Either way, his privacy and Emma's would be destroyed. The pressure to resolve her situation, one way or another, was becoming overwhelming. But it was Emma herself who created the most emotional complexity. As they worked together preparing for the audition, their bond had deepened in ways that transcended mentor and student. She trusted him completely, sharing fears and dreams with the openness of someone who'd finally found safety after months of uncertainty. "Sometimes I wonder what my real family was like," she said one evening while they reviewed music theory concepts. "Do you think my birth parents were musicians? It would explain why music feels so natural to me." The innocent observation made Dorian's chest tight with the weight of secrets he was carrying. "It's possible," he managed. "Musical talent often runs in families. I used to imagine that maybe my parents weren't really dead, just lost somehow. That someday they might find me, and we could be a family again." She paused, concentrating on a particularly difficult passage in her audition piece. "But now I think maybe family isn't just about blood. Maybe it's about people who care enough to help you become who you're supposed to be." The comment was delivered without any expectation of response, just Emma thinking out loud, as she often did. But it hit Dorian with devastating accuracy. Here was his sister unknowingly describing exactly the choice he faced, whether to ground their relationship in blood connection or let it develop based solely on genuine care and mutual respect. Dr. Morrison had been working with Emma on 3 pieces for the audition: a Bach invention that would demonstrate her technical precision, a Chopin nocturne that would showcase her emotional expressiveness, and as the centerpiece, an expanded arrangement of Moonlight Dreams that he'd helped her develop into a full composition. "The original melody is beautiful," Dr. Morrison had explained to Dorian, "but Emma has shown remarkable instinct for harmonic development. We've created variations that demonstrate her creative potential as well as her performance abilities." Watching Emma practice the expanded version of his mother's song, Dorian felt layers of meaning that would have been impossible to imagine weeks earlier. This wasn't just a talented child playing a beautiful piece. This was his sister honoring their shared heritage, developing their mother's composition into something that reflected both her training and her natural gifts. The week before the audition brought final preparations and mounting anxiety. Emma practiced with increased intensity, perfecting every phrase and musical gesture. Dr. Morrison scheduled additional lessons to ensure her confidence and preparation. Dorian made final arrangements with the conservatory, confirmed details with Dr. Vasquez, and tried to manage his own nervousness about Emma's performance. The rental agreement for the recital hall specified a 2-hour window on Saturday afternoon, with access to the conservatory's finest concert grand piano and professional quality acoustics. The audition would be attended by Dr. Vasquez, 2 other admissions committee members, and a representative from the Scholarship Foundation that would fund Emma's education if she was accepted. Friday evening, as Emma ran through her audition pieces one final time, Dorian realized he'd reached the moment of truth about their relationship. Tomorrow's audition would determine whether Emma gained access to the musical education she deserved. But regardless of the outcome, she deserved to know that her success or failure would be witnessed by her brother. "Not just a benevolent stranger, Emma," he said after she finished playing. "There's something important I need to tell you before tomorrow." She turned from the piano bench, sensing the gravity in his voice. "What is it?" Dorian looked at this remarkable child, his sister, and felt the protective walls he'd built around his heart crumble completely. "It's about our families, about connections that go deeper than either of us realized." The DNA test results were still in his study desk drawer, proof of a relationship that transformed everything about their connection. Tomorrow, Emma would audition for a place at one of the world's most prestigious music schools. Tonight, she would learn that she wasn't alone in the world after all. "What kind of connections?" Emma asked, her voice curious but cautious. Dorian took a deep breath, knowing that his next words would change both their lives forever. "The kind that make us family." As he began to explain about their father, their shared history, and the genetic testing that had confirmed his suspicions, Emma listened with the focused attention she brought to difficult music. Her expression shifted from surprise to wonder to something approaching joy, as she realized that the bond she'd felt with him wasn't coincidental or one-sided. They had work to do. Tomorrow, an audition that would shape Emma's future and prove her extraordinary talent to people who could provide the opportunities she deserved. But tonight, for the first time in either of their lives, neither of them had to face their challenges alone. The Manhattan Conservatory's recital hall felt like a cathedral dedicated to music. Afternoon sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air above the gleaming Steinway concert grand that dominated the stage. As Emma sat at the piano bench, adjusting her posture with the careful precision Dr. Morrison had taught her, the silence in the room was profound and expectant. Dorian watched from the audience section, his hands clenched so tightly in his lap that his knuckles had gone white. Beside him sat Dr. Elena Vasquez, her expression professionally neutral, but her attention completely focused on the small girl who was about to attempt something extraordinary. 2 other conservatory faculty members flanked her, clipboards ready, their faces reflecting the skepticism of people who'd seen countless auditions and developed protective cynicism about exceptional claims. In the corner of the room, a video camera captured everything for the official audition record, the device that would create the artifact determining Emma's future. This wasn't just a performance. It was a permanent record of talent, determination, and the moment when years of hidden potential would finally be revealed to people with the power to nurture it. Emma had chosen to begin with Moonlight Dreams, the piece that had brought them together, and now carried the weight of their shared family history. As her small hands settled on the keys, Dorian felt his breath catch in his throat. Everything they'd worked toward, everything she'd endured and overcome, came down to these next few minutes. The first notes emerged with crystalline clarity, each tone pure and perfectly placed. But this wasn't the tentative performance of a child playing beyond her abilities. This was music-making of startling maturity and emotional depth. The weeks of intensive preparation with Dr. Morrison had transformed Emma's natural talent into something approaching artistry. She'd grown into the piece in ways that astonished even Dorian. The melody that had once seemed almost too complex for her small hands now flowed with effortless grace. But more importantly, she'd found her own voice within the composition, adding subtle interpretive choices that honored his mother's original intent while reflecting Emma's unique musical personality. The expanded arrangement she and Dr. Morrison had developed unfolded like a conversation between past and present. The simple lullaby his mother had written during their darkest nights had been transformed into a sophisticated composition that showcased harmonic complexity, rhythmic variation, and emotional range. Emma moved through each section with confidence born of countless hours of practice, but also with the spontaneous expressiveness that marked truly gifted musicians. Dr. Vasquez leaned forward in her seat, her professional mask beginning to slip as she recognized what she was witnessing. This wasn't just a talented child playing a pretty piece. This was a young artist demonstrating musical understanding that defied her age and circumstances. The other faculty members exchanged glances, their skepticism replaced by something approaching wonder. As Emma reached the climactic section of the piece, her playing took on an intensity that filled the recital hall with raw emotion. Every note carried the weight of her journey, the months of practicing on cardboard keys, the nights sleeping under bridges, the dreams deferred but never abandoned. The music became a statement of survival, resilience, and hope that transcended technical perfection and entered the realm of profound communication. Dorian felt tears streaming down his face as he watched. His sister transformed pain into beauty through sheer force of will and talent. This was what his mother had meant about music belonging to everyone. It wasn't about expensive instruments or exclusive audiences, but about the human capacity to create meaning from sound, to share the deepest truths of experience through organized vibration of air. The final notes of Moonlight Dreams faded into silence that seemed to stretch forever. Emma sat motionless at the piano, her hands still positioned over the keys, as if she were reluctant to break the spell her performance had created. The adults in the room remained equally still, processing what they'd just experienced. Dr. Vasquez was the first to speak, her voice carefully controlled, but unable to hide her amazement. "That was remarkable, Emma. Truly remarkable." She paused, consulting her notes with hands that trembled slightly. "I'd like you to continue with your other prepared pieces, but I want you to know that what you just shared with us was extraordinary." Emma smiled, the first genuine expression of joy Dorian had seen from her since they'd entered the conservatory. "Thank you. This piece is special to me. It was written by someone important to my family." The simple statement carried weight that only Dorian fully understood. Emma was claiming ownership of their shared heritage, acknowledging the connection between her musical gifts and the family history she'd only learned about the night before. The possession in her voice when she said "my family" made his chest tight with pride and protective love. As Emma moved into her Bach invention, Dorian realized that the audition had already succeeded in ways that transcended admission to any program. She'd proven to herself that she belonged in this elite environment, that her talent could command the attention and respect of professional musicians who dedicated their lives to musical excellence. The Bach piece showcased different aspects of her abilities: technical precision, rhythmic consistency, and the mathematical logic that underlied Baroque composition. Where Moonlight Dreams had demonstrated her emotional expressiveness, the invention revealed her intellectual approach to music, her ability to navigate complex counterpoint with clarity and purpose. Dr. Morrison had been right about Emma's perfect pitch and innate musical understanding. Every note was exactly where it needed to be, every phrase shaped with intention and intelligence. The faculty members took detailed notes, but their body language had shifted from professional assessment to genuine engagement with artistry that demanded recognition. The Chopin Nocturne that concluded her audition brought yet another dimension to Emma's musical personality. The romantic style suited her natural expressiveness, allowing her to explore the kind of emotional nuance that separated competent players from genuine artists. Her interpretation was both age-appropriate and surprisingly sophisticated, revealing an intuitive understanding of musical structure and emotional pacing. As the final notes of the nocturne dissolved into silence, the room felt charged with the electricity that follows truly exceptional performances. Emma sat quietly at the piano, her hands folded in her lap, waiting for the response that would determine whether her musical dreams had a future or would remain forever out of reach. The audition recording captured it all. Every note, every gesture, every moment of a transformation that changed not only Emma's life, but everyone who witnessed it. This 8-year-old girl who'd been practicing on cardboard keys, just weeks earlier, had just delivered a performance that would be discussed in conservatory faculty meetings for years to come. Dr. Vasquez stood slowly, her composure finally breaking as she approached the piano. "Emma, in 25 years of conducting auditions for this institution, I've never encountered anything quite like what you've just shared with us. Your talent is extraordinary, but more importantly, your musical communication is profound and genuine." She paused, looking at the small girl who just redefined her understanding of what was possible. "We'd like to offer you a full scholarship to our advanced preparation program, with the understanding that your musical education will be carefully guided by our finest faculty." The camera captured Emma's reaction: surprise, joy, and something deeper that Dorian recognized as the relief of someone who'd finally found where she belonged. His sister had done more than pass an audition. She'd proven that talent and determination could overcome any obstacle, that music truly did belong to everyone who approached it with sincerity and dedication. The conservatory's faculty lounge had been cleared for their private conversation, afternoon sunlight casting geometric patterns across the polished wooden table where Dorian had placed a manila envelope containing the final piece of their family puzzle. Emma sat across from him, still glowing with the success of her audition, but sensing that something profound was about to unfold between them. "Before we celebrate your acceptance," Dorian said carefully, "there's something else you need to know about our connection. Something I discovered through research that goes beyond what I told you last night." Emma's expression grew serious, the mature attention she brought to complex music now focused entirely on him. "What kind of research?" Dorian opened the envelope and withdrew a single photograph, black and white, slightly faded, showing a family group at what appeared to be a church picnic. In the center stood a man Emma had never seen, but whose features were unmistakably reflected in her own face. The same dark eyes, the same stubborn chin, the same way of holding his head when considering something important. "This is our father," Dorian said, watching Emma's face carefully. "Marcus Langston. It's the only photograph I have of him." Emma studied the image with the focused concentration she applied to difficult sheet music, noting details that confirmed what Dorian had begun to suspect from their first meeting. The resemblance was undeniable, not just physical features, but something in the man's expression that echoed Emma's quiet intensity and natural confidence. "He looks like me," she said softly. "But how did you find this?" "How do you know he was my father too?" Dorian explained about the DNA testing, the timeline that connected Marcus's death to Emma's birth. and the gradual revelation that their shared musical gifts came from more than coincidental exposure to the same melodies. As he spoke, Emma's expression shifted from surprise to wonder to something approaching joy. "So we're really brother and sister?" she asked. "Not just because you decided to help me, but because we're actually family." "Half siblings," Dorian clarified. "Same father, different mothers. But yes, we're family in the most literal sense." Emma was quiet for a long moment, processing this information with the thoughtful deliberation that characterized her approach to everything important. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a mixture of sadness and understanding that seemed far too mature for someone her age. "He left you too, didn't he? Just like he left me." The simple question cut straight to the heart of pain Dorian had spent decades trying to forget. "Yes, when I was 12. My mother and I never heard from him again." "Were you angry?" "For a long time, yes. Angry and hurt and confused about why he didn't want to be part of our lives." Emma nodded slowly. "I used to imagine what my real parents were like. Sometimes I thought they must have died in an accident or something terrible, because I couldn't understand why anyone would just leave their child behind." She paused, studying the photograph again. "But maybe some people just aren't good at being parents, even when they want to be." The generous interpretation of their father's failures revealed Emma's remarkable capacity for forgiveness, a quality that made Dorian's initial response to her seem even more shameful in retrospect. Here was a child who'd been abandoned twice, first by their father's death, then by a mother who couldn't cope with single parenthood, yet she was trying to find understanding rather than blame. "Emma," Dorian said, his voice thick with emotion he no longer tried to hide, "I need to apologize for something. When you first appeared at my gala, when you asked to play for food, I laughed. I joined the crowd in treating your request like an intrusion, like you didn't belong in that world." Emma's expression grew thoughtful, but not accusatory. "You were protecting yourself." "What do you mean?" "You'd built this successful life, and seeing me probably reminded you of things you didn't want to remember. When people have been hurt, sometimes they protect themselves by keeping away from anything that might hurt them again." The wisdom in her observation left Dorian speechless. This 8-year-old child understood psychology and self-protection with the insight of someone who'd learned early that survival sometimes required emotional distance. But unlike him, she'd managed to maintain her capacity for trust and connection despite her experiences. "You're right," he said. "I had forgotten who I used to be, where I came from. I'd convinced myself that caring too much was dangerous, that helping people would make me vulnerable. But you did help me. Even after you found out we were related, you could have sent me to foster care or found someone else to take care of me. Instead, you taught me piano and arranged for my audition and made me feel like I mattered." Emma stood and moved around the table, settling into the chair beside him rather than across from him, a small gesture that felt momentous in its implications for their relationship. "I don't care that you laughed at first. What matters is that you changed your mind and decided to care about me." The forgiveness she offered so easily broke through the last of Dorian's emotional defenses. For the first time since his mother's death, he allowed himself to cry without shame or self-consciousness. Tears of grief for the years they'd lost, tears of relief that Emma was safe and thriving, tears of joy that he was no longer alone in the world. "I promise you," he said, taking her small hand in his, "I will never again forget that we're family. Whatever happens with business or boards or anything else, you will always have someone who believes in you and wants to help you succeed." Emma smiled with the radiant expression he'd learned to recognize as her genuine happiness. "And you'll always have someone who knows where you came from and loves you anyway." The photograph lay between them on the table, their father captured in a moment of apparent contentment. Surrounded by family he would ultimately abandon. But rather than representing loss or failure, the image had become a bridge connecting their separate experiences into a shared story of resilience and recovery. Dr. Vasquez appeared in the doorway, her professional composure restored, but her excitement still evident. I hope I'm not interrupting. But I wanted to personally deliver Emma's official acceptance letter and scholarship documentation. As Emma received the papers that would transform her musical education from dream to reality, Dorian realized that his own transformation was equally complete. The man who'd measured success only in profit margins and market positioning had discovered that the most important achievements couldn't be quantified in spreadsheets or board presentations. He was no longer just Dorian Langston, CEO. He was Dorian Langston, brother to the most talented young musician he'd ever encountered, inheritor of his mother's belief that music belonged to everyone, and guardian of promises that mattered more than any business deal he'd ever negotiated. Their father had failed them both, but his failures had ultimately brought them together in ways that redeemed both their lives. Emma had found family, safety, and opportunities to develop her extraordinary gifts. Dorian had found purpose beyond profit and emotional connections that made success meaningful rather than hollow. The family photo would go home with them tonight, placed on the piano where Emma practiced, not as a reminder of abandonment, but as evidence that even broken families could be rebuilt stronger than before. 6 months later, Dorian stood in the same ballroom of the Grand Metropolitan Hotel where Emma had first appeared at his luxury piano gala. But tonight's event bore little resemblance to that exclusive gathering of wealthy collectors and status-conscious investors. The room buzzed with different energy: teachers who worked in underfunded schools, students from community music programs, families who'd saved for months to afford their children's piano lessons, and young musicians whose talent far exceeded their financial circumstances. The centerpiece of the evening wasn't an Aurora Grand priced beyond most people's reach, but rather a beautiful upright piano bearing a new nameplate. Langston Access Series, making music accessible to everyone. The instrument cost less than a tenth of his luxury models, but had been crafted with the same attention to quality and tonal excellence that had built his company's reputation. At the piano sat Emma, now 9 years old and visibly thriving after months of proper nutrition, stable housing, and intensive musical training at the conservatory. She wore a simple blue dress that complemented her restored health and confidence, her hair neatly braided, but her expression holding the same depth and intelligence that had first captivated him. As her fingers moved across the keys in a piece by Chopin, the audience listened with the reverential attention reserved for truly exceptional artistry. Dorian watched from the wings, holding a leather portfolio that contained the document representing his complete transformation, the new charter for Langston Pianos that would guide the company's future. The board meeting where he'd presented these changes had been contentious, but the results spoke louder than Victoria's objections ever could. Pre-orders for the Access series had exceeded all projections. Positive media coverage had enhanced rather than damaged the company's reputation, and several major investors had specifically praised the initiative's social impact alongside its business potential. Victoria Morrison had resigned 3 months earlier, unable to accept the company's new direction. Robert Chen had initially resisted the changes, but gradually recognized their strategic wisdom as sales figures proved that accessibility didn't mean sacrificing profitability. Dr. Foster had become one of the program's strongest advocates, helping design scholarship initiatives that connected Langston Pianos with music educators who understood their value. Emma finished the Chopin piece to sustained applause, then turned to address the audience with the poise she'd developed through months of conservatory training and public performances. Thank you for coming tonight to celebrate music that belongs to everyone. I'd like to close with a piece that's special to my family, a song that reminds us that beautiful things can come from difficult times. As she began Moonlight Dreams, Dorian felt the same emotional response that had overwhelmed him at the original gala. But tonight, instead of tears of recognition and regret, he felt the deep satisfaction of promises kept and purposes fulfilled. His mother's simple lullaby had become the signature piece for a movement that was transforming. how his industry thought about accessibility and social responsibility. The melody filled the ballroom with the same haunting beauty that had first broken through his emotional defenses, but now it carried additional meaning. This wasn't just Sarah Langston's composition, it was Emma's inheritance, Dorian's redemption, and a family's shared commitment to making music available to anyone with passion and dedication. Marcus approached from the side of the stage. His assistant had proven invaluable in managing the complex logistics of Emma's guardianship, her conservatory schedule, and the launch of the Access series. So the community center representatives are here to discuss the piano donation program. They're particularly excited about the instruments going to the Riverside District. The Riverside District, the neighborhood where Dorian and his mother had struggled, where Emma had first heard Sarah's lullabies through thin apartment walls. 20 new Langston Access pianos would be installed in community centers, schools, and public spaces throughout the area, ensuring that the next generation of children wouldn't have to practice on cardboard keyboards while dreaming of real instruments. As Emma's performance concluded and the audience responded with the kind of enthusiastic appreciation that came from genuine emotional connection rather than social obligation, Dorian stepped onto the stage. The speech he'd prepared focused on the company's new mission, but standing beside his sister, he found himself speaking from the heart instead. 6 months ago, I thought I understood what success meant, he began, his voice carrying easily through the room without amplification. I measured everything in terms of exclusivity, profit margins, and market positioning. I believed that the most valuable things were those that only a few people could afford. He paused, looking out at faces that reflected the diversity he'd spent decades trying to exclude from his world. Then a remarkable young musician taught me that true value comes from sharing gifts, not hoarding them. That real success is measured by how many people you lift up, not how many you leave behind. Emma stood beside him, her presence a reminder of how much both their lives had changed since that first evening when she'd slipped past security to ask a simple question about playing for food. The scared, homeless child had become a confident young artist with a bright future. The isolated CEO had become a brother, mentor, and advocate for the transformative power of accessible music education. Tonight marks the official launch of the Langston Access Initiative, Dorian continued, opening the portfolio to reveal the new company charter. Our mission is no longer to create instruments for the wealthy few, but to ensure that anyone with musical passion has access to quality instruments and education. Because music doesn't belong to an exclusive club, it belongs to the human spirit. The charter represented more than corporate policy changes. It was a commitment to honor his mother's values, to support talented children like Emma, regardless of their circumstances, and to use his business success as a tool for positive social impact. The luxury division would continue serving clients who valued premium craftsmanship, but it would now fund scholarships, community programs, and accessible instruments for those who needed them most. As the evening concluded and guests mingled around the various Langston Access models on display, Dorian found himself in conversation with Charles Wilson. The elderly music teacher had been released from jail after pro bono lawyers arranged by Dorian had successfully challenged his arrest. Now he served as a consultant for the Access Initiative, helping identify talented children who needed support and guidance. You know, Charles said, watching Emma demonstrate piano techniques to a group of fascinated young students. That child has given you as much as you've given her. Maybe more. Dorian nodded, understanding exactly what Charles meant. Emma had returned to him the capacity for genuine connection, the ability to find meaning beyond material success, and the courage to honor commitments that mattered more than board approval or shareholder profits. In saving her, he'd rediscovered parts of himself he'd thought were permanently lost. Later that night, after the last guests had departed and the hotel staff had cleared the ballroom, Dorian and Emma sat together at the Access Series piano. She was practicing a new piece for her next conservatory recital while he reviewed the evening's feedback and planning notes for future events. "Dorian," Emma said, pausing in her practice, "do you think our mother would be proud of what we're doing?" The question, Emma now referred to Sarah as our mother, having claimed full membership in their small but significant family, made his throat tight with emotion. "I think she would be amazed by how far you've come and how many people your music is going to inspire." Emma smiled and returned to her practice, filling the empty ballroom with music that transformed the commercial space into something sacred. As Dorian listened to his sister play, he realized that success wasn't about building walls between himself and the world. It was about using whatever gifts you'd been given to make the world more beautiful, more just, more full of possibilities for everyone. The grand piano that had started their journey together now sat in the lobby of a community center in the Riverside district, available to anyone who wanted to learn. Sometimes, late at night when the building was quiet, neighborhood children would slip inside to practice on its keys, keeping alive the same musical dreams that had once sustained a scared boy and his mother during their darkest times. Music, as Sarah Langston had always believed, truly belonged to everyone. And finally, her son was making sure everyone knew it.